Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. Erica Hornthal is the therapist who moves you. She is a dance and movement therapist as well as a psychotherapist. And she combines these two loves of hers and the experience and training that she has in these to work really effectively with people with trauma. We all long to feel comfortable and at home in our body. Doing therapy that combines our insights, our thoughts in our mind with what's going on in our body as a therapeutic method of releasing trauma is really effective, and it's kind of fun as well. Erica Hornthal, the therapist who moves you. And I think that's such a great description for what you do. And I love your posts on Instagram. Every time I read one, it's like, yes, that's exactly it. So I'm really excited that we get an opportunity to talk. So you are a dance movement therapist. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, how you got into that, and then we'll get into what that is exactly.
I went to school for psychology. I got my bachelor's undergraduate in psychology, and then always loved dance and movement, dance in particular. I don't know if I identified myself as a mover so much as a dancer growing up,
Mhm.
but found my way to the field of dance movement therapy. So I actually got my master's degree in dance movement therapy and counseling, which was a dual program. And wanted to work right away, but as most counselors, social workers go, needed experience. And so mainly was working in nursing homes, adult day centers, mostly with cognitive and memory impairments until I was finally able to open my own practice. And I've been doing that since 2011. And yeah, just really trying to continue to create awareness and visibility for our field, which has been around for over 60 years, and just still so little is known about it. So thank you for the opportunity to share it.
There's so much interest right now over the last 5 or 10 years in particular around trauma and somatic experiencing and Peter Levine's work, but also all of the somatic therapies that are out there now. And like you
Mm,
say, this has been around for a long time. And my particular movement is yoga, also been around for thousands of years.
right.
But
Centuries.
yes, exactly. How would you describe what you do, dance movement? And then what would it look like in a typical session as well? Or is there such a thing as a typical session?
I think there's a typical session for us, which looks very atypical for everybody else, right?
Okay.
Um, so the formalized definition with regard to, or as defined by our governing body, which is the American Dance Therapy Association, they talk about it being the psychotherapeutic use of movement to integrate mind, body, spirit, to facilitate emotional, cognitive, spiritual, even physical aspects of an individual. As I've been working more and more, I realized that definition was actually quite limited because I was realizing not many people understood what psychotherapy was. Not
Uh,
many people knew what integration was. And so I thought, wow, I really need to rethink this definition, which I was so proud of myself for like finally acknowledging and memorizing. So for me, I really try to highlight that dance movement therapy is really about looking at all of the nonverbal communication that happens and that is housed in our bodies, which is really much more than any verbal communication we experience. We don't even learn to talk for the first few years if we're on that typical development track. And yet our bodies are talking. We're speaking our needs or they're being neglected. We cry, we scream, we express ourselves in so many ways beyond language. And yet, when we have formal language, the rest kind of goes out the window, right? The body becomes secondary. So for me, dance movement therapy is using body, it's using body awareness, it's using movement, it's using aspects of dance, mindful, bodyful presence in order to regulate, in order to integrate, in order to be able to express ourselves more fully so that ideally we can change these habits that are maladaptive, ultimately allowing us to recover, right, or to move through places of hardship and challenge. And dance
so,
is one aspect of that.
So one of the things that I think is true for me and probably for other people too is that when I think about dancing in front of somebody, I
Mm.
feel a little nervous about that. So how does that work when you're doing the therapy with people?
Sure. So you asked, like, what's a typical session, right? I think it really depends on the practitioner. I have many colleagues where dance is the forefront, right? They're putting on music and we're really letting the body express and then processing or highlighting. What was that for you? How does that feel? What does that mean? Kind of the metaphors, right, that come up through movement. For me, I've noticed that my sweet spot is really bringing people into awareness of how their body is moving and takes up space so that we can start to repattern and challenge the way we move so that ultimately we change the way we think. Thoughts lead to movement, but what a lot of us don't recognize is that movement and sensation leads to those thoughts, and our emotions are embodied, right? It's not just about changing the thought to change the behavior, but we want to change the movement that changes the thought, that then changes the behavior, that then changes the movement, right? It's like this big cycle. So for me, that will often look like talking, verbal processing, and I will invite in opportunity for us to validate, acknowledge the movement patterns and habits that are present, and then allow us to interrupt them. Right. So sometimes that looks like having someone almost in a sense, I don't want to say act out in terms of drama, but embody their story, right? So you can either do it verbally and through movement, or maybe we just do it through movement alone. Show me what you're experiencing if words were not present. And then we can do it once or twice, kind of ingraining that movement habit or pattern, that story into our body. And then someone can say, okay, this is what I'm experiencing. This is where it gets really, really anxious or depressing or overwhelming for whatever reason. And we can literally move through it differently. So, instead of taking this path, I walk to the side, I step back, I lower my shoulders, I pause, and I take a breath. So, in real time, we're learning to use the body to support the emotional overwhelm that we're experiencing. Other times it is more structural, right? We can offer, I call them movement prescriptions, but we can do things that actually address and move the parts of our bodies that are holding on to these really challenging and sometimes destabilizing emotions. It's never about forcing people into something that's totally out of their comfort zone. All of the movement is really starting with and ending with the person. And then sometimes a good old fashioned dance party, like
Right?
sometimes we do just need our favorite song or something, really that allows us to be present in the moment to just let loose and let our body move as it needs to, not as our mind wants it to. So it's a little difficult because most of the clients I see are not comfortable being in their bodies. And then you're asking me to witness the discomfort in that body. So it's a lot of managing expectation. I think it's a lot of communication of where do you feel most safe having me present? Would you like me to sit? Would you like me to move with you? Would you like to close your eyes, so that you're not seeing me watch you? But I will say more often than not, once we get started, it's so incredibly validating for my clients to have a witness because for many of them, this is the first time that they're really being seen for who they truly are.
So there's a lot there. One of the things that comes to mind is some of the studies they've done around music and memory. And I know
Mhm.
I saw on your website you work with people with Alzheimer's and different kinds of medical conditions. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So that's actually where I started. My first internship was working at an adult day center. And typically my clients were, I would say, in their 80s, somewhere in their 90s. A few were already past 100. One client in particular had early onset Alzheimer's. He was 35. But it gives you an idea of like the population, right? Men, women, but you know, different range of physicality. It wasn't like everybody was in a wheelchair. A few were, but most people were still very mobile. And what I really loved about working not just with older adults who carried all this wisdom, like all this life experience, was that also there was a little bit of playfulness and childlike qualities. Not that I was treating them like a child, because that was completely the opposite. But it was almost like this mix. We had the best of both worlds. We have these really wise, knowledgeable individuals who have had a lifetime of experience and this lowered inhibition, right? Which sometimes was a challenge, but more often than not, they were willing to do the movement. We could put on some music and they would start dancing, they would start expressing themselves, singing, creating, right? When a lot of clients, even just 20, 30 years younger than them, are so stifled in their creativity, right? They're so disconnected to their creativity. Um, Working with them taught me that just because you can't speak doesn't mean you don't have anything to say, because it was in those moments that they were saying exactly what they needed to say. People
Right.
were telling them what to do, toileting many of them, right? They're losing their independence. And it was through the body, through movement, that they were actually able to take charge, right? To have some agency, to actually be heard. And oftentimes, many of the anxieties, the quote, behaviors that we would see that needed medication would go away. Maybe if only for a moment, but it was life changing for them as well as their caregivers, right? For caregivers to see, oh my God, dad hasn't stood up in years. Mom hasn't smiled in 3 months.
Right.
Um, to reconnect to the people that they knew, right? Maybe they're no longer in relationship with them in that way, but they were able to reconnect to the people that they knew was really powerful and transformative in many ways.
And I think there is a kind of an opening or a freedom as we get older. I just turned 70. I don't think I've reached that stage yet of I've earned the right to say whatever I want to anybody. Because I was so annoyed when my mother would say that. Like, yeah, and everybody else has the right to not listen to you too. So you still have to be human and polite with people.
Right. Yeah,
I
when inhibitions are lowered, right, because of like cognitive impairment, we don't
oh,
always have that level of awareness. So things come flying out.
oh, I see. Okay.
It's interesting, right? But I hear what you're saying, that we still have this filter sometimes that we go through, and that makes us hyper aware of how we show up, right? How we look or
Right,
how much space we take up. Yeah.
right, right. So when you're working with someone in a therapeutic context, because you're also a psychologist, so is
Mhm.
everybody who does dance movement, are they also trained as a psychologist, or is that just you?
Dance therapists, it depends on how they're getting their that clinical piece. Some dance movement therapists do not practice clinically. They have their board certification in dance movement therapy, but they might not have that counseling side. Um, so that's to say that someone can be a registered or a board certified dance movement therapist. I, in order to practice as a psychotherapist in my state, I'm in Illinois, I needed to be licensed as a counselor, a social worker, or a psychologist. So I have my master's in counseling, which allowed me to uh, seek out right licensure as a counselor. Um, so it really depends on where you live, also what your
Oh,
intention is with regard to your practice. There are many dance therapists out there that are on the academic track, so they are PhDs and they're teaching, they're educating.
mhm,
um, I have some colleagues out in California where I think their licensure is different. It's either a licensed marriage and family therapist, or they go for their like their PsyD, right, in order to become a psychologist and practice that clinical piece. So it really depends. My personal path was I was on that track to being a counselor, sat for my licensure, and so I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor as well as a board certified dance therapist.
right, right. So what is it that convinced you that movement therapy would be such a wonderful approach therapeutically?
Well, a little bit of stubbornness. Quite honestly, I did not want to relinquish my connection to the field of dance. But I also recognized how much I think natural skill I had for the sciences. That, gosh, I spent a lot of time in school studying, biology and and chemistry and physics. And I really liked it. And so I thought, well, I'll go into medicine. But that didn't really sit with me. I was like, I don't really want to be a doctor. Maybe I'll be a nurse. But nursing, I wanted to be there for people. I'm not so great with body fluids. So I was like, how do I clean up emotional messes? And I was like, ooh, I
Oh,
could become a therapist. That's interesting. My grandmother was a social worker. I have teachers and educators in my family. I was like, but but then I can't be a dancer. So what do I do? And thankfully, it was a academic advisor that told me about the field of dance movement therapy. And I thought, well, this is the perfect marriage of my two passions, dance and therapy, psychology, helping people. I think my understanding of it has drastically shifted as I've continued to practice. And what I recognize now is because one, there is such an openness, a pathway to seeing body and movement within the capacity of healing, but also that we're not quite looking at it in the lens that dance therapists do. That's just continued to kind of fuel, again, this bit of stubbornness in terms of people need to know what this is, right? It's like I have so many clients that say this was the missing piece. I've tried things like different somatic interventions, EMDR, somatic experiencing, and they're a step in the right direction, but sometimes there is still something underlying that's stuck. And it takes that piece of like listening to and just witnessing the body and then allowing our clients to do that for themselves that really, really shifts the perspective. So it started as a passion and a labor of love with regard to like mixing the two things that I love the most. And now it's kind of morphed into, gosh, how do we make sure that body is present in every therapy setting, every psychotherapy session, that at the very least, we're asking our clients, not only how do you feel, but how are you moving with regard to how you feel?
when I think about doing a session like that, and especially if we're thinking about working with trauma,
Hmm.
one of the things that happens with trauma, of course, is we go into some kind of a survival response, fight, flight, or freeze often. So
Yeah.
do you work kind of from that perspective of, you're in with somebody and it's like, okay, this person's clearly kind of shut down. How can I open things up? Or how does that work?
So, yes, I've had those experiences. I actually remember the first time I was with a client who we would always talk about how her operational skill set was dissociation,
Hmm.
which I never see as something bad. It's how we stay safe, how many of us are able to stay connected in those moments. Um, and so I remember the first time that it happened in our session. And I thought, one, where better for this to happen, right? Because this is the container that we've created to explore these things. Two, it gives her the opportunity to actually move through it with me. But three, it gives me the opportunity as a therapist to actually hone that skill that I bring in of being with someone in their experience, right? So much like talk therapists will say, that reflective listening, right? Like active listening. For movement therapists, we have that, but we also have this ability to meet them in their body. So I remember like getting down on the floor with her, and not mimicking, but really like modeling, joining her in that experience so that we're on the same level. There's the same intensity and tonality of the body and in our voices. We're continuing to hone that trust, right? That regard that like we're in this together. This is teamwork. I don't know any more than you do because I don't know what it's like to be in your body, but I can try my best to be in your shoes in these moments. So with regard to trauma, I think what's really helpful is we're meeting the body where it is. And as we know, like when we're in those trauma responses, we can't verbalize what we're feeling, or those centers of reason and logic go offline. And we get to actually directly communicate with the source of where the trauma response is happening. And so it can be very quiet in those moments, depending on what response is coming up. It's about reestablishing connection first. So we can do that through rhythms. We can do that through sound, through sight, through touch. And when we get just um, a little bit more communication, if you will, like a little bit more awareness, then we can start to actually move through that place and restore balance, right? Restore connection. So I remember with this particular client, right, it was just continuing to notice the shifts that were happening, right? She was kind of huddled in a ball on the floor. And all of a sudden I would see just a little bit of movement in her feet. And I could draw attention to like, what parts of you do you feel like you can move right now? Okay, well, my toes. All right, let's wiggle our toes. Right. And then slowly that started to migrate on her own. And before I knew it, she was sitting up. And so I would say, I notice you're sitting up. What are you feeling right now? Right. Well, I feel my feet. I feel my legs. I said, okay, let's tap into our breath. Okay, I'm feeling a little bit out of breath. So it wasn't about even, let's take a breath. It was just notice where the movement is happening. Let's focus on that and allow it to migrate. And so essentially, yes, I was facilitating it, but by the end, she moved herself through that space of dissociation, was actually able to walk out that door, and confident and balanced, not because she was freaking out on the inside. There's no way to plan that, right? Like if it happened again, it would look very different the next time. It's really just about physically being present to our clients, which is very exhausting. Like I always say, I can't do 8 to 10 clients a day. It's just too much for my own body.
Right.
Um, but that's how we work through those trauma responses because we're not entering through the mind. We're really just trying to meet the body where it is in that trauma response.
So I have a person I've worked with who has a strong history with dance.
Sure.
She has her whole life, and she does ballroom dancing primarily,
Mhm.
and very, very much as a nervous system therapy. Like she has so much energy in her body that if she dances, she comes back into regulation.
Mm,
And she's got a big traumatic history and is pretty dysregulated when she's not dancing. But it's
mm.
just like a miracle for her if she can dance. Then there's the connection with other people, but there's the movement, the energy moving through.
I realized, I think many years ago now, but it took a while for me to realize that dance is quite literally what kept me moving through life when I always say like it had other plans. Like take the
Yeah.
pandemic, for example, right? I actually wasn't the kind of person that was dancing in my living room. But what I was doing was making sure that I was paying attention to how my body wasn't moving and bringing in opportunities to provide the exact opposite. If I was feeling very closed and restricted, I would make sure that at some point throughout the day, I was giving myself the opportunity to spread out or to stretch or to take a deep breath, which is hard when you're home with little kids, and kind of going stir crazy. I think it takes this balance too, because especially within the field of dance, there's a lot of trauma in dance itself. So as a
Right.
dance movement therapist, I don't end up seeing a lot of dancers because there is that double-sided like, ooh, dance is my trauma. And you're asking me to dance in my therapy session. I don't know about that. But at the
Right.
heart of it, it's body, it's mistreatment of body. So if we can learn to be together with our body in a healthier, what sometimes feel like a more productive relationship, it actually makes us better performers, better dancers. We also have to look at our affinities for movement. So take a ballet dancer, for example, right? They're very accustomed to a specific set of movement. It's elegant, it's graceful, but it's very controlled. And that translates to so much outside of the dance studio that sometimes I'll suggest, take on other movement forms. Have you ever taken, a hip hop class? Have you taken Bharatanatyam? Have you done yoga, Tai Chi? Like modern, modern was a revolt, a rebellion from the confines of ballet. And for some people, it's like, no, 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 I follow the rules, right? I
Right.
have this strict regimen, right? How we move very much connects to who we are. All right. So if we want to change who we are, we have to look at creating more robust movement vocabularies, and so it's always interesting, right? When someone really does thrive on the dance floor and that's where they truly let go, what is it about that we're not bringing into our daily life? Can I bring more of that flow? Can I bring more of the syncopation or the sensuality of the tango into my life so that I'm essentially dancing through life, not just in the dance studio. Otherwise, we'll continue to play out those scenarios, right? Where we're someone else outside of the dance studio, and we get such relief and release when we're dancing, but we can feel so confined and stuck when we're not.
Well, what immediately comes to mind is that it's a lot riskier to do
Mhm.
that outside of the dance world. Um, so in a dance role might be with a partner and touching and have that connection, and that can be quite intimate. And then in the real world, relationship might be quite risky, and we might have a lot of history with dangerous or harming relationships as well.
Sure, sure. And I think that's one of the beautiful pieces actually about what I do is that, therapy, I always say therapy really only works if there is a trusting relationship. You know, it's the kind of the double-edged sword of where we are today in terms of like self-healing, pop psychology. It's like so much of it can be on us. We can do ourselves. But a lot of what we need is really repairing relationship, right? Severed relationships, usually from childhood, where we've kind of learned these maladaptive behaviors, can really only be rewired in relationship. So
Right.
here you have someone that you could be in relationship with also in your body, which again can feel very scary and very unsafe. But we do it in this very compassionate, gentle, mirroring, right? Attuning way. So people really come into their own. So the thought of, oh my God, that's too overwhelming. I can't do that is actually replaced with, wow, that was actually very supportive. I wasn't expecting that.
Right.
um, we're only moving as far as that person's really capable of in the moment. So we can always pause or stop. We can always, talk, kind of distract in the ways that we need to so that we're not hyper focused on our bodies either. But I totally agree with you. I went to this recovery conference a few weeks ago, and we all came to this conclusion really that to dance is an act of courage and bravery when you have been taught that your body is less than, when your body holds all of the pain from, years and years of living. It's not as simple as just turning on music and dancing. So many of us have to, um, we have to be intoxicated. We have to be on, a substance to really truly allow ourselves to dance.
Mhm.
So just this idea that like without anything, just me, it takes such courage to show up in this body and to move, dance even when I've been taught everything but, you know, disconnect, don't be in your body. Why would I want to dance? That's so uncomfortable, right? That we're all showing up as we are, and it can be one of the most healing things.
So a few years ago, I interviewed Dr. James Gordon from the Center of Mind Body Medicine, and he does
Yeah.
a practice that I've been doing since then of breathe, shake, dance, and
Mm,
and he would do it in person with like 500 people, and they would do some mindful breathing, they would do some shaking, some breathing, and then put on some music and dance together, and then breathe again. So it's very much a somatic mindfulness practice.
yeah.
The dance part of it, there's something really different. So I do this every Saturday morning now, and as part of my daily practice with people, and we go through that whole kind of process. And
Mm,
so when we start with the breath, it's like it can be pretty brave just to tune into our breath as well, of course, right?
yeah.
And then you do the shaking. The shaking and the dance with the music is so different. The shaking is very enlivening, and we can get some of that stuck energy out and all of that.
Yeah.
Then we go back and tune in with the breath. But then when we dance, that's what just there's something about it that just brings us alive in a way that shaking or other kinds of movement doesn't really. There's something about the creativity of it, or what's your sense
Mm.
of that?
Well, it's been said many times before, but dance is really our first form of communication. There's been Martha Graham, right? So the body never lies, and Ruth St. Dennis, kind of this idea that, when words stop, the body takes us the rest of the way. So my take is that these are things that we did when we were first brought into this world, right? Without conscious awareness. Like our kids dance in the grocery store, right? They dance in the most inconspicuous, sometimes what feels like to us inappropriate places. because they're free to do so. There isn't necessarily that conscious mind that's saying, this is going to look silly. People are going to stare at me. Quite the opposite. People are like, oh, that's so cute. Oh, look, she's adorable, and we
Right.
get praised for it for the most part. But we as adults are so far from that experience because we've lived so much longer in conscious awareness, in conscious mind, where my mind says that's not appropriate, or someone told me that's not okay. You look ridiculous. You should never do that again. Don't dance, right? You have no skill. Not that we want to just, dance like everybody's watching or dance like you're a kid again, because that's not so easy. Some of us, it's been 40 years since we let ourselves do that.
Right.
I've noticed that redefining dance and movement has been extremely helpful. So I did not actually come up with these, but I remember when I was researching my book, looking at, well, what are the definitions that are already out there? So I remember Google searching dance, and I think it was Encyclopedia Britannica or Britannica.com. And the first definition of dance was actually rhythmic body movement that expresses a thought, an idea, or emotion. So I thought, rhythmic body movement. Well, that's everything. Like, that's all of us. Our bodies are always moving to a rhythm, our heartbeat, our breath. Nowhere in there did it say anything about choreography, music, musicality, tone, nothing. Now, granted, if you look a little bit further, it defines the art of dance, right? The art form, the performance aspect of dance, which not everybody connects to. I don't even really connect to it all that much anymore. I don't know that I really ever did. That's probably why I'm not a professional dancer. But when we look at dance as a rhythmic movement of the body that expresses an idea or thought or emotion, that is quite literally why it's possible for everybody and why sometimes we can feel so free when we do it. Because if we allow ourselves, to kind of circumvent the mind that's telling us maybe not to do it, we realize we are a living, breathing body of emotion. And it feels
Mhm.
so good to express ourselves in ways that we suppress so often, and that's why art is very uh, validating for many people. Creating music or singing, it's no wonder when everything went on lockdown, people were turning to TikTok for dance challenges and singing and creating art, expressing themselves, because quite literally when we're silenced, we have to turn to our bodies to be heard, right? Or to
Right.
create that connection. And then movement it's just a change in posture or perspective. So every time we breathe, that's movement. Every time we blink, that's movement. If we want to think differently, sometimes I tell people just change your body posture, like shift from one side to the next. I know when I was writing my book, like I would change posture all the time just to spark a new idea so that I wasn't just stuck in the same movement, the same posture, because that's when my mindset kind of got stuck. And then I would just be in writer's block. So, really looking at these definitions of what dance and movement truly are opens the world of, wow, we can all do this. This is
Right.
possible.
Right.
Just because I stopped dancing, in a studio at the age of 6 doesn't mean that I don't have the capacity to express myself through body movement. Because, for many of us, we need that. We don't realize we need it or that we can do it until our language is compromised, right? Or until we're kind of in this situation where we can't move our body as freely as we used to.
When I think about working in the body, trauma is stored in our body. There's sensations, energies, and feelings, emotions. Just on a sensation level, there's sensation in the body that can feel quite uncomfortable. And it can feel quite uncomfortable to work with the breath as well, to even pay attention to the breath. When people start to work with moving the body, it sounds like they're the ones that are generating the movement, or they're the ones. So you say sometimes you'll kind of move along with them. When someone starts to move their body, maybe they had an experience where they were held down and they couldn't move away, and then they start to move their body. Is there a way in particular that you help them work with that, or how might that look in a session?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to meeting our body in where it is or how it's already showing up, right? So if it's pain, I use pain as a really good example, whether it's physical or emotional pain, right? We feel this constriction in our body. we tend to focus on it, right? Our brain is primed for this negative bias. So we're always kind of looking for that, the painful, the uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Not that we want to do it, but sometimes to avoid it, right? And then we end up fixating on it. Sometimes it's beneficial to go into the movement that's there. If someone says, I don't know how to move, right? Or I don't know, I'm so stuck. So I'll say, well, what movement's possible? What do you already notice that is moving in your body? And it can take a little moment, but all of a sudden we might notice, well, I just felt my belly move. Oh, I'm breathing. Okay. So let's acknowledge that, right? Can we exaggerate it? Can we play with it? Can we hold it? Can we release it? Then we can also look at the opposite, right? Like, what are the parts of you that are immobile? Or what are the parts of you that you're not even connected to? Do you have an awareness of your earlobe? Like sometimes bringing in this, like,
Right.
what? Do you have an
Right.
awareness of your elbow? No, so it's kind of like bringing in oh my gosh, I never thought about that, or kind of sometimes it feels humorous, um, really taking us out of that comfortable, like, well, I know what this feels like. I know what that feels like. I know where my pain is. I'm like, okay, well, let's pick a part of the body that we're not really used to connecting with. So we create this dialogue, right? And then sometimes it's the sensation we feel internally, but then we can also use our own body or clothing. What do you feel on that part of your body? What's the temperature around that part of your body? So again, it's not just how can I move this part, but it's also the movement, the energy, the emotion that is around that part of the body, the sensation, right? Because sensation is the language of the body. So if we're not really in touch with or unsure of how the body communicates, we can just start to get back in touch with sensation. What do I touch? What do I hear? What do I smell? What do I taste? That I find is a big opening for clients that are very hesitant or fixated on, like, am I dancing? How do I dance? What does this look like?
Wow. Right.
I'm so aware or like insecure, right, of how my body is showing up. That
Mm.
just to have agency over, oh, well, yeah, I can move this part of my body. Sometimes I go back to the cliche of head, shoulders, knees, and toes,
Mhm.
or those childhood games in a sense where we were learning our body, right? Like I have young kids, so I remember they don't know what a nose is. We're teaching them, oh, wait, that's your nose. Can you wiggle it? Can you snort? Can you sniff? Can you squeeze it? Just because we're adults doesn't mean that one, we're in touch with these parts, but two, that we're regularly touching in with, tapping into them. Um, I know where my nose is. Do I interact with it on a regular basis? Probably not unless I need to blow it, or unless it's itchy and I need to take an allergy pill. Looking at ways that we can relate to and communicate with our bodies as opposed to just how we move it is a really big in for a lot of clients. And then, yeah, it just kind of sparks conversation or dialogue. And I'll have clients come back the next week and they're like, you know what? I was standing in the grocery line and I noticed my foot was tapping, or
Oh,
my shoulders got really tight. And I recognized that I was really anxious or it was taking too long. It was really uncomfortable. And just noticing those things have been really big for me because I never paid attention to them before.
so much of our attention goes to our thoughts and
Yes.
not in our body. Yeah.
Yes. And then, like, even now we're using body through mind, so we want to be mindful of body and then we're going to think about what we do as we do it, versus like a really wonderful exploration that doesn't take a lot of time, but I like to do is moving from mind versus moving from body. And so the difference is just the example of think it before you do it, right? So I'm going to lift my right arm. I think it and then I do it versus I'm going to have thoughts, but I'm just going to let my body move however it wants without the directive of what I'm doing before I do it. And that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people too. And then all of a sudden they realize this isn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. It comes with a lot of
Ah,
judgment. My mind is having a hard time keeping up. I
right.
might still feel insecure, but so much more movement happens outside of my conscious awareness that it can be very like reaffirming. It's kind of like that light bulb, like, whoa, there is a lot of movement happening throughout the day that I wasn't even aware of.
So that awareness piece is a really big one to
Hmm.
start to track what's going on in our body. I know for
Yeah,
me, I started to become really aware of how often my shoulders were creeping up towards my ears.
me
And
too.
that's
Me
my big
too.
one. Most people have one of those places, clench their teeth, or they brace in their shoulders.
Yeah.
Even if it's quite subtle, even when if I'm sitting here doing something I totally am enjoying, or I'm walking around or something, I can go, I can almost always soften that a little bit more. So
Yeah.
this residual tension that we hold in our bodies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's fun. That's my place too. My shoulders, my neck.
Yeah.
And I'll just notice now throughout the day, like maybe a few years ago, it would be this huge, oh, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
oh, I was really holding on to that and not even realizing it. And now it's almost just a very subtle, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm catching it before it even gets to that point, adjusting, just minimally throughout the day, especially because we're on our screens a lot. We're on,
Right.
Zoom or even virtual sessions where it's still
Yeah.
really important that I look at or pay attention to how my body is showing up in those moments so that I can have more of an open mind, right? And just ease some of that tension that builds throughout the day.
So sometimes we have these ways of kind of common things that are happening in our body. So
Mm.
often I'll say, "Are you bracing yourself for trouble?" The
Mm.
shoulders, or fear. We might feel that in our gut. There's some kind of movement or growly kind of butterflies or something, anxiety in our gut. Do you work directly with that, or is it something that you would maybe point someone to what's happening in your stomach right now, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I like to do actually in usually the first, if not like the first two sessions when I meet with someone, not that this isn't something that we'll continue to do throughout our work together, but oftentimes we're so disconnected from how emotions are embodied that we'll do a little kind of like a body mapping exercise. They'll have a little diagram and I'll ask them to think about an experience or maybe what they've brought into therapy that day. Oh, I had this argument with my spouse and gosh, it just makes me so angry. So I'm like, okay, I want you to map on that body where you're experiencing anger, right? If you couldn't just tell me, oh, I'm so angry, how do you know? Where does your anger show up? And what I love about the experience too is we can add on other emotions and then we start to see how different
Mm.
emotions exist in the same place. And then
Mhm.
it's the quality of the movements and the sensations that actually differs. It's how long it lingers, it's how intense it is. And then I think that opens up more for the conversation of where do you feel that? Right now that we have this reference of, oh, I know how to feel things in my body and pay attention to them, I can say, oh, so that anger that you're feeling, where do you notice that? If we don't have that awareness, then we can always start with the movement piece, the sensation. Someone might say, I don't know what I feel, but I do know right now I've got this burning in my chest, or my stomach's so tight right now. Um, and acknowledging that, right? Okay, so just be with that for a moment, right? The directive I love to use is how can I bring more comfort to my body in this moment? So if my stomach's very tight for whatever reason, and I can say, is there a way that you can bring more comfort to that part of your body? Maybe they lean back. Maybe they touch, or massage their stomach. Maybe it's grumbling and they're actually hungry. They brought
Right.
something with them. They take a bite and they can satiate that hunger. So again, we're not looking at the body as something that needs to be fixed, but as signs and signals that it's communicating. What does this mean? Why is this present? A stomach ache could be a bug. It can also be indigestion. It can be fear. It can be anxiety. Um, Much like when we meet someone for the first time, like we have to have this willingness to communicate, to listen to them and
Mhm.
then to have this open dialogue. And so often we just shut it down. We're like, oh, that hurts. I'll just pop a pill. And then it's like,
Right. Right.
did it really solve the problem or did it put a band aid on it? So another thing I love to explore is this idea of like movement as a balm versus movement as a band-aid. Is movement something I'm just using to cover things up, to make myself feel better in the moment, or to ignore something completely? Or am I really using my movement to help create a balm, like to soothe a wound or a need? To heal myself. It's very different. The two are very different. And exercise can exist in both of those, but it's not the end all be all, you know?
Right.
So yeah,
Mhm.
communicating with our body, whatever that means, if it's recognizing the sensation that's already there or noticing what sensation is present as we talk about it, it's all necessary.
It's one thing that a lot of times people will say when they first start meditating is, my mind got a lot busier. And I'll often say, well, actually, it was probably always that busy. It's just now we're noticing it. Do you find
Right.
people have that experience with sensation in the body as well? That all of a sudden it's like, whoa, there's so much going on in here.
Yes, and that in itself, that can be overwhelming, you know?
Yeah.
So what we often see with whether it's dance therapy or just somatic practices in general, clients are actually widening their window of tolerance. We're not just learning to get back into it, but we're actually expanding it. And then with that comes sensation, comes feeling. So a client that may have had trouble connecting to their anger is all of a sudden like, well, I notice that I'm angry all the time. You know, everything makes me angry. I'm
Right.
like, okay, that might be the case. Are you connecting to your anger? Right. Well, yeah, I'm moving through it, but I'm just feeling it all the time. Like, because you're exercising that muscle. You know, it's literally this emotional muscle that you're starting to exercise. So people will say, like, oh, I've been crying a lot, you know, or um, I've just it's been much more intense, the intensity of my emotions. And you know, how we manage that is really important, but the acknowledgement of it's intense because it's often the first time you've been experiencing it, or it's been a long time since you've experienced it. If you
Right.
had no emotions, you know, you told yourself, someone told you you
Right.
couldn't have emotions, and now all of a sudden you're in touch with all of them,
Right.
it can be super overwhelming. So, yeah,
Right.
much like you can be really in touch with your thoughts, and then you're so analytic of everything, the same thing can
Mhm.
happen to sensations, and then you're really present to it all. And we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves through that too. You know, that we don't want to intentionally numb or create unhealthy disconnections, but those are the times when it's okay to take a moment, you know, to watch a TV show, right? To scroll on our phone, to do something that makes us a little bit less aware, just to
Right.
create that perspective, you know, so that we're not
Right.
burning out on healing the body, because
Right.
that's not helpful either. We need a spectrum, we need a balance. And that's when we can go into movement practices for mental health, but we can also do movement practices just to kind of escape sometimes. I don't think it's not a good or bad, right? It's allowing ourselves to be in both and understanding what's productive and what's healthy and what, you know, hinders the healing.
If somebody is just starting to think, I'd like to do some of that. I don't really have a therapist. I can't really find somebody to do this dance movement with.
Mm.
However, I'd like to start kind of exploring that. Is there any way that you would suggest for people to kind of move into that?
Yeah, you know, we're in a day and age where there's so many great resources available to us online. I know Insight Timer has not just meditations or moving meditations, but there are practices on there that dance movement therapists are actually recording and making accessible. A new app that's called Soma Share. There's content there where, on an individual level, you can start to integrate or connect to your body in those ways. If you either don't have a therapist or just don't want to have a therapist, that's okay too. You know, it's our prerogative to choose how we enter into a relationship with our body. Sometimes those cost money though. So if you're looking for free opportunities, I would say just this awareness piece, you know, of can I give myself the time and space like I would to connect with a friend, to connect with my body? I do something with clients, this body awareness journaling, you know, that I'll ask people to just say, notice a thought, right? How does it impact your body? And how can you move your body part to help ease that thought, right? Or what's one way that I can support my movement, my body to move through this intense place? That's just a simple practice you can do at any point, you know,
Right.
just the acknowledgement of how this shows up in my body, how I can move my body, and you know, kind of holding ourselves accountable to that awareness. So it can look a lot of different ways. You know, there's lots of free resources. You can go to the ADTA's website, which is adta.org, and there are resources there. There's also a directory, right, of dance therapists in your area. So if you are looking to practice this with someone, many of us do take insurance. So if you have health insurance and you want to be able to use that, you can.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but I never want people to stop themselves from trying it just because it's not in their area, right? Or doesn't seem either financially or geographically accessible. At the very least, you can always, find me, reach out to me at the therapist who moves you, and I will, try my best to connect you to some practice or some person that can help support that journey.
And let's talk about your books. That's another source. So do you want to just kind of say what they are and a little bit about them, what people might find in them?
Yeah, my book that I published last year is called Body Aware, and it's all about rediscovering the mind body connection, helping us move through these stuck places, and improving our mental health through simple movement practices. So it talks a lot about what we talked about today. It's, redefining movement, how we can use movement to help support change and ultimately, transform either, maladaptive thoughts or behaviors. In March, I have a card deck coming out. It's called the Movement Therapy Deck. And that is 52 mindful movement practices to help us regulate our nervous system and process trauma. That was really born out of the recognition that after I live just a few miles away from Highland Park, Illinois, which is unfortunately where we had a tragedy 2 years ago on the 4th of July. And I
Mhm.
just so desperately wanted to be able to basically like give people a pocket guide to just regulating their nervous system. They couldn't even talk about what they were feeling or experiencing because they were in shock. And so that's an attempt to basically create a resource that says if you can't talk about it, you can still move through it.
Right.
And that again, that comes out in March. So we have a little bit of time.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. And maybe you could mention your website too, so that people could find you there.
Sure, it's ericahornthal.com. So it's ERICAHORNTHAL.com. It's a great way to connect with me, email me. My phone number is listed on there. And then, as you mentioned, Instagram at the therapist who moves you is usually where I'm most active. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or concerns. I love to connect with people that way, and then to take the relationship off of social media, and
Right.
talk on the phone or email or something, so that we have that
Right.
level of connection.
Right. Well, thank you so much for getting together today. It's been
Mm.
fascinating to move into this world, the dance movement therapy world with you. And I really appreciate that you did this with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I wish you all the best.
This is Lynn Fraser. Join us for the 2024 Radical Recovery Summit, January 12th to 21st. RadicalRecoverySummit.com.